When that Netflix series Ancient Apocalypse dropped, it did a lot more than just get people talking. It set off this massive, explosive public feud between its host, Graham Hancock, and the entire scientific body of the Society for American Archaeology. So, the big question is, who really gets to write our history? Let's get into it.
So what we've got here is a real clash of the titans. In one corner, you have the established scientific consensus, the professional archaeologists. And in the other, a super popular author who's challenging every single thing they believe. This is way more than a simple disagreement over some facts. It's a fundamental clash of worldviews.
All right, so here's our game plan. We're going to look at the letter that started this whole firestorm, dig into the accusations of professional disparagement, tackle the absolutely explosive charge of racism, then get to the core fight over the actual evidence, and finally, zoom out to see the bigger battle for the past itself.
Okay, so how did this whole thing kick off? Well, it all started when the Society for American Archaeology, we'll call them the SAA, sent this very strongly worded open letter to Netflix. And that move, it prompted a super detailed, point-by-point public takedown from Graham Hancock, setting the stage for a major showdown.
The SAA's main demand was pretty simple. They wanted Netflix to reclassify the show. They were basically saying, hey, this isn't a documentary, it's fiction. They argued that Hancock's claims were totally false and that his theories had zero basis in actual archaeological evidence.
Well, Hancock did not take that sitting down. He fired back immediately. And he brilliantly framed the SAS's letter not as some kind of scientific debate, but as a blatant attempt to censor him and control the entire historical narrative. He was basically asking, is your job to tell the public what to think?
And that brings us to the first major battleground in this whole affair. The SAA claimed the series wasn't just presenting a different theory. No, they said it was actively trying to harm the entire profession of archaeology. So the SAA's argument was that Hancock was essentially dragging their members through the mud, devaluing their life's work, and spreading what they called disinformation about their whole field.
But Hancock's defense is very specific. He says, look, I'm critiquing archaeology as an institution, like you'd critique any big organization. He makes it clear that he never attacks a single individual archaeologist in the show. Then he completely flips the script. He claims the SAA's letter is the real personal attack, designed specifically to ruin his reputation, and that it's just the latest shot in a decades-long campaign against him.
Okay, now, this is where things get really heavy. The debate moves from a professional disagreement to one of the most serious and damaging accusations you can possibly make.
So the SAA drops an absolute bombshell. They claim that the very idea of a lost, advanced civilization is at its core racist. They argue that this isn't some new idea, that it actually has deep historical roots in old colonial stories that were used to deny indigenous people credit for their own incredible achievements. Essentially, they're saying it's a white savior narrative.
Hancock calls this a spurious attempt to smear by association, a fancy way of saying they're just trying to sling mud. He points out that race is never ever mentioned in the series, and that the places he's proposing for this lost civilization, they aren't in Europe. Then he turns the whole accusation right back on the SAA, asking how a mostly white organization can claim to know the true meaning of indigenous stories better than the indigenous people who passed them down for generations.
And this is where it gets so interesting, because Hancock doesn't just argue with words, he uses the SAA's own data against them. He brings up a 2015 census of their own membership, highlighting that the organization is overwhelmingly white, with less than 1% of its members identifying as Native American.
And it all leads to this direct challenge, a real mic drop moment. He uses their own demographics to question their authority on issues of race and the interpretation of indigenous history. He's basically asking, who are you to make these kinds of claims?
So, let's pivot. Let's step back from the personal, from the political, and get to what this is all supposed to be about, right? The science, the actual evidence, or the lack of it, for an advanced global Ice Age civilization.
The ASA's position here is crystal clear. They're basically saying, look, we've been digging for over 100 years. We found zero evidence. Nothing. For them, the case is closed. Where's the metalworking, the writing, the cities, the large-scale farming, all the hallmarks you'd expect from an advanced civilization?
But Hancock comes back with this classic philosophical principle. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. What he means is, just because you haven't found something doesn't automatically mean it doesn't exist. He argues that archaeologists haven't found the evidence simply because they haven't been looking in the right places.
And this slide just perfectly illustrates his point. He argues that archaeologists have pretty much ignored these vast, unexplored regions of our planet. Just think about it. Millions of square kilometers of land that was swallowed by the sea at the end of the Ice Age. The massive areas still hidden under the Amazon jungle and the sands of the Sahara. His question is simple. How can you be so sure something doesn't exist if you haven't even looked there?
So all of this builds to the final, and maybe the most important piece of this conflict. Because this was never just about ancient rocks and dusty artifacts. It's really about modern power, and who gets to control the story of us.
And when you boil it all down, what you really have are two completely different philosophies. The SAA sees its role as protecting expert knowledge, as the guardian against what it considers misinformation. But Hancock sees his role as the exact opposite, to challenge that consensus, to question authority, and to bring some balance to what he sees as a totally one-sided debate.
And that leaves us right here with the central question at the heart of this entire firestorm, a question that goes way beyond archaeology. When a popular news story comes along and challenges everything the experts thought they knew, who ultimately has the authority to decide what's fact, what's fiction, and who truly gets to write our history?